While the Mustangs, Corvettes, and Chargers of the world still grace posters and collector auctions, a whole separate category of cars has quietly faded into the void. These were vehicles that didn't stand out in their day and have since become ghosts in the American automotive memory. They weren't always terrible, just tragically average, awkwardly timed, or completely overshadowed by more exciting competition. Whether they were sales flops or just forgettable placeholders, these 10 American cars have been erased from history.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10. By 1970, Mercury was trying to define itself as a more upscale alternative to Ford. But the problem was that Mercury's lineup was stuffed with overlapping models, many of which blurred into one another. That's where the Montego MX came in, a mid-tier, mid-size car that didn't know if it wanted to be a budget luxury cruiser, a muscle car, or a practical family ride. Squeezed between the sportier Cougar and the more economical Comet, the Montego MX ended up lacking personality, lacking performance, and ultimately lacking staying power. Let's unpack what went wrong. Mercury in the late 60s and early 70s was in a tough spot. It was positioned above Ford, but not quite Lincoln luxury, offering muscle cars like the Cougar XR7, sedans, wagons, and personal luxury coupes, competing against a crowded market of intermediates like the Chevrolet Chevelle, Pontiac Le Mans, and Dodge Coronet. To cover the bases in the mid-size segment, Mercury created the Montego, introduced in 1968 as the counterpart to the Ford Fairlane/Torino. Within that lineup, the MX trim was the nicely equipped but not fancy middle child. Too dull to impress, too expensive to be basic. The 1970 Montego MX came in several body styles: two-door hardtop coupe, four-door sedan, station wagon, convertible rare. Design-wise, it had a long, square-edged body, wide split grille with horizontal bars, subtle character lines along the sides, optional hidden headlights on some trims, but not standard on the MX. A vibe that was more staid than sporty. It looked like it wanted to be aggressive. But then you open the hood. The base MX came with 250 cubic inch inline six. Not exactly thrilling. Optional small block V8s, 302, 351. Some versions could be optioned up to a 390 or even 400, 428 V8, but few were. The suspension and steering were tuned for comfort, not speed, making the Montego MX feel more like a retirement cruiser than a youth-oriented machine. Despite the muscle car looks, most Montego MX buyers were getting around 150 to 200 horsepower, automatic transmissions, and soft ride quality. The Cougar XR7 was for performance. The MX-IT was for people who wanted a little more than a Fairlane, but not much else. This is where the MX really fell flat. It had no clear purpose. Not sporty enough to draw in younger buyers or muscle car enthusiasts, not luxurious enough to lure buyers away from the Cougar, Thunderbird, or Grand Prix, not economical enough to compete with base-level Fairlanes or Comets, not versatile enough, especially the coupe, to be a practical family car. The result? A car that was completely forgettable in a market that was rapidly dividing between economy, performance, and luxury. The Montego MX was neither a bestseller nor a notable flop. It just kind of existed. It sold well enough to keep the nameplate alive, but not enough to make any lasting impression. By the mid-1970s, Mercury was already shifting focus. Montego was slowly morphing into a Cougar-based personal luxury coupe. The Comet and later the Monarch would take over the economy car role. The MX badge quietly disappeared as Mercury streamlined its trims. Today, most people remember the Cougar, the Comet, or the Marauder, but few recall the Montego MX. The 1970 Mercury Montego MX was a car that never defined itself. It wasn't bold enough to turn heads, fast enough to excite, or practical enough to matter. Sandwiched between more memorable models in Mercury's lineup, it suffered the ultimate automotive fate: irrelevance. It wasn't a bad car, it just wasn't a memorable one. And in a decade that gave us GTOs, Roadrunners, Chevelles, and Chargers, that's the same as being invisible. Number 9. When you think of 1970s Chevrolets, the names that come to mind are Chevelle SS, Camaro Z28, or even the Nova. But tucked in the shadows of that lineup was a curious anomaly. The 1973 Chevrolet Concours, a Malibu-based upscale trim that wanted to add some class to Chevy's midsize lineup and failed to make an impression. Even die-hard GM enthusiasts sometimes blink when you mention it. And if you bring up the wagon version, crickets. Let's explore why the 1973 Concours was so quickly forgotten, even though it was supposed to be the premium face of the Malibu nameplate. By 1973, Chevrolet had just undergone a major redesign of its A-body intermediates. Out went the hardtops and convertibles, and in came the colonnade body style, with thick B-pillars and fixed rear-side windows. This was a big deal. General Motors was moving toward a new safety-minded, formal look for its midsize cars. With the Chevelle and Malibu continuing as volume sellers, GM saw an opportunity to introduce trim-level stratification, and that's where the Concours came in. Think of it as a more refined Malibu, a car with extra style, extra comfort, but no extra performance. It was supposed to be a big deal, but it wasn't. Visually, the 1973 Concours tried to distance itself from its Malibu siblings, but didn't go far enough. Exterior styling included unique grille pattern, though subtle, upgraded trim and brightwork, distinct badging, usually on the fenders, optional vinyl roof, available only as a four-door sedan or station wagon, no coupe, interior perks, faux wood grain accents, slightly better seat fabric and trim, more insulation for a quieter ride. Basically, it was a Malibu that had been dressed up for dinner, but it still looked like a car your neighbor would forget owning 5 years later. Mechanically, the Concours was identical to the Malibu, which is to say, standard 250 cubic inch inline six, optional 307 cubic inch, 350 cubic inch small block V8S, 3-speed manual, 4-speed manual, or 3-speed automatic transmission. There were no performance enhancements, no unique suspension tuning, and no sport packages. In other words, it was all show, no go. If you expected anything close to a Chevelle SS experience, the Concours would be a massive letdown. One of the Concours' oddest aspects was that it was available as a station wagon, making it the fancier alternative to the Malibu wagon. But there was a problem. The Chevelle and Malibu wagons already sold well. GM had other wagons like the Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser, Pontiac Le Mans Safari, and Buick Century Estate with stronger styling and brand cachet. Buyers looking for a luxury-ish wagon usually went upmarket, not slightly up from a Malibu. As a result, the Concours wagon barely moved the needle. Today, it's one of the most forgotten vehicles GM ever sold in the 70s. Here's where things unravel. Chevy buyers looking for value already liked the Malibu. Buyers wanting true luxury bought an Impala or Caprice. The Concours lived in a blurry middle ground with no compelling reason to exist. Worse, Chevrolet never put marketing muscle behind it. There were no commercials proclaiming it as a cut above. It didn't appear in any movies. It wasn't raced. It wasn't driven by any celebrities. It simply was. The Concours name didn't last long in this form. It was offered on the 1973 model only in this configuration. The name would return later in the 70s on Nova-based hatchbacks, which were also quickly forgotten. Today, few Concours models survive, and even fewer get restored. In collector circles, the 1973 Concours is mostly seen as a parts donor for Malibu or Chevelle restorations, a curiosity at best, a "what was this again?" car at worst. The 1973 Chevrolet Concours tried to be the Malibu's tuxedo-wearing sibling, but wound up being the awkward cousin at the family reunion. It had no performance edge, no standout style, and no clear market niche. In an era of bold muscle cars and flashy personal luxury coupes, the Concours was the equivalent of wallpaper, pleasant, inoffensive, and instantly forgettable. It's a perfect example of how not to create a trim line by adding style without substance and expecting buyers to pay for something they didn't ask for. The name Dodge Monaco might ring a bell for fans of the Blues Brothers movie, but let's be clear, The iconic Bluesmobile was a 1975 model. The 1974 Monaco Brougham, by contrast, is a largely forgotten barge from Chrysler's bloat era, when bigger meant better, and more chrome was somehow a substitute for substance. Before it became cool by cinematic association, the Monaco Brougham was just another full-size land yacht adrift in a sea of forgettable 70s luxury pretenders. Let's unpack why this car felt like excess for the sake of excess, and why it failed to make much of a splash, until Hollywood gave it a second life. By the early 1970s, Brougham had become the go-to marketing term for gilded luxury without actual refinement. GM, Ford, and Chrysler all had their Brougham trims, offering vinyl roofs, plush velour or brocade seats, extra chrome, simulated wood grain interiors. The 1974 Dodge Monaco Brougham followed this script to the letter. It was Dodge's highest trim level on the full-size Monaco, meant to compete with the likes of the Ford LTD Brougham or Chevrolet Caprice Classic. But here's the problem. Once you peeled away the chrome and faux luxury, there wasn't much underneath. Visually, the 74 Monaco was built on the C-body platform, a massive, heavy structure shared with other Chrysler full-size cars. Its design reflected everything wrong with early 70s styling: rectangular everything, grille, headlights, taillights, a tall, flat front fascia that looked like it wanted to be a wall, slab sides and thick chrome moldings, the dreaded opera windows, optional, a half vinyl roof that always looked aftermarket. The Monaco Brougham wasn't ugly per se, it was just unremarkably large. It had no sporty leanings, no grace, and no distinct design touches that separated it from other Chrysler yachts like the Newport or New Yorker. It was just there. A slab of metal and vinyl meant for retirees and middle managers. Despite the size, the Monaco Brougham came with real Detroit muscle on paper. Engine options included 360 cubic inch V, 8 base, 400 cubic inch V, 8 440 cubic inch Magnum Vi, 8 optional. But by 1974, smog controls, emissions mandates, and lower compression ratios had strangled performance. The once potent 440 was a shadow of its former self. Fuel economy was dismal, single digits in the city. Acceleration felt sluggish thanks to the 4,600-pound curb weight. You could brag about cubic inches, but behind the wheel it felt more like steering a ferry than driving a sedan. Step inside a 1974 Monaco Brougham and you'd find thickly padded seats, usually in plush cloth or vinyl, simulated wood grain across the dash and door panels, optional tilt wheel, cruise control, and power everything. A very floaty ride, courtesy of Chrysler's soft suspension. It was built for comfort, yes, but at the expense of any real feedback or road feel. You floated, you leaned in corners, and if you pushed it too hard, the car responded with body roll and tire squeal. The Monaco Brougham wasn't cheap, but it wasn't exclusive either. It lived in an awkward price space, too expensive for basic buyers, not prestigious enough for upward climbers. Sales were modest, but nothing spectacular. It was overshadowed by the Chevrolet Caprice Classic, America's favorite luxury boat, the Ford LTD Brougham, more recognizable, better marketed, even internal competition from the Chrysler Newport, which looked nearly identical. No one bought the Monaco Brougham because they wanted one. They bought it because it was available. Ironically, the only reason the Dodge Monaco name survived in pop culture was thanks to the 1975 Monaco that starred in the Blues Brothers. That car, outfitted as a used Illinois State Police cruiser, became legendary for its jumps, car chases, and deadpan toughness. But again, that was the 75 with different trim and styling. The 74 Brougham never got its time in the spotlight. It was too dressed up to be a cop car and not distinct enough to stand out on its own. The 1974 Dodge Monaco Brougham was one of those 70s cars that mistook girth for luxury and chrome for character. It checked all the right boxes for a land yacht: big engine, big seats, big body, but it failed to carve out an identity beyond being yet another vinyl-roof cruiser lost in the crowd. Today, it's mostly remembered by Mopar completists, or by people confusing it with its more famous movie cousin. It serves as a perfect example of how style without substance rarely leaves a lasting impression. Number 7, in 1971, American Motors Corporation, better known as AMC, introduced the Matador, a mid-size sedan intended to replace the outgoing AMC Rebel. Hopes were high. The company needed a solid player in the crucial mid-size market to take on Detroit's heavy hitters like the Chevy Chevelle, Ford Torino, and Plymouth Satellite. But instead of making a bold impression, the Matador sedan debuted with a name few people liked and a design that felt like an afterthought. It was mechanically sound, yes, but as bland and forgettable as a government fleet vehicle on its third oil change. AMC executives thought Matador sounded bold and exotic, a name with Spanish flair, drama, and maybe even a little danger. But in practice, not so much. To the American ear, Matador didn't conjure performance. It conjured confusion. In Spanish-speaking markets, it was worse. Matador literally means killer, which raised eyebrows when printed on a family sedan. Some buyers thought it sounded cartoonish or overly macho. It didn't help that the name replaced the more grounded, everyman-sounding Rebel. At least the Rebel had some attitude. The Matador was trying too hard. If AMC was hoping to woo buyers with cutting-edge design, they missed the mark in 1971. The Matador sedan looked like it was designed with a ruler and styled by committee. The body had all the excitement of a rental car. A wide front end featured basic stacked headlights and a simple grille. There were no standout creases, no dramatic swoops, and certainly no muscle car cues. The rear end tapered awkwardly and lacked any visual punch. The coupe version that followed in later years at least had some flair. But the sedan? It was the automotive equivalent of taupe carpeting. AMC wasn't trying to make the Matador a hot rod, just a dependable family sedan, and in that sense, it actually delivered. Engine options included a base 232 cubic inch inline-six, optional 304, 360, and 401 V8S for those seeking more power, paired with either 3-speed manual, 3-speed automatic, or column shift setups. Mechanically, the Matador was competent. It started in the cold, got decent gas mileage for the time, and didn't fall apart. The ride was reasonably smooth, and the brakes were effective, but it was never exciting. Even the V8s felt muted in this body style. The Matador was the kind of car you bought if your main goal was get to work and back. Step inside the Matador and you'd find bench seats in either vinyl or cloth, neither luxurious. Simple rectangular dash layout with straightforward controls, optional AC, AM, FM radio and power steering, but nothing upscale. Plenty of space, but no sense of atmosphere. The entire cabin was designed for function, not flair. It did the job, but it didn't charm you while doing it. Despite being reasonably priced and reliable, the 1971 AMC Matador sedan made almost no impact on the broader market. It suffered from weak marketing compared to Ford and GMA's bland visual identity, a name that confused more than it intrigued. AMC's overall reputation as the budget brand for people who couldn't afford the big three. The Matador failed to build a strong identity, and most buyers simply passed it over for more recognizable nameplates. Interestingly, the Matador found a second life as a police cruiser in some regions. Equipped with the 401 V8, it offered decent power and proved sturdy under pressure. But that was only in the hardtop and coupe configurations. The sedan was too vanilla to be remembered for its service and uniform. The 1971 AMC Matador sedan is a textbook case of a car that met expectations, but inspired no emotion. It was reasonably priced, mechanically dependable, spacious and simple, and yet no one talks about it. Why? Because the Matador lacked the style of its rivals, the charm of its predecessor, and the innovation that AMC was sometimes known for. It wasn't a disaster. It was just wallpaper. The kind you forget is even there until you move out of the house. Number 6. By the early 1970s, American roads were ruled by land yachts and family wagons. Before the SUV revolution, if you needed to haul kids, groceries, and perhaps a dog or two, your go-to was a station wagon. Enter the 1972 Ford Torino Squire wagon, a middleweight in Ford's sprawling lineup, wrapped in plastic wood grain and pitched as the stylish suburban solution. But despite all the paneling, this car didn't carve out much legacy. Oversized, under-inspiring, and quickly lost in Ford's reshuffling of names and trims, the Torino Squire wagon became the background noise of American suburbia. The Squire trim was Ford's way of saying premium, though in the 1970s that meant slathering the sides of your wagon in vinyl wood grain decals. The simulated wood was supposed to echo the classic woody wagons of the 1940s and early 50s. By 1972, though, it was pure nostalgia cosplay. Plastic, prone to fading, and completely artificial. The wood was framed by chromish trim that further emphasized its fakeness. It was the automotive equivalent of putting laminate on a particle board bookshelf and calling it heirloom furniture. The Torino name had a strange arc. It started in 1968 as an upscale Fairlane trim, then replaced the Fairlane outright, then evolved into a muscle-adjacent family car. By 1972, it was available as a sedan, hardtop, fastback, and yes, a station wagon, positioned as a mid-range option between the budget-friendly Ford Maverick and the larger LTD. But here's the problem. Torino didn't mean much. Unlike the Mustang or Thunderbird, it had no clear identity. Was it sporty? Was it practical? Was it stylish? The answer was always, kind of. The Squire wagon version tried to be all things to all families, and ended up not standing out in any way. The 1972 Ford Torino Squire wagon offered a buffet of engines, including a base 250 cubic inch inline-six, not ideal for a car this size, V8s ranging from 302 to 429 cubic inches. Most were mated to a 3-speed automatic. It could move decently with the larger V8s, but this was no performance machine. Handling was numb, braking was adequate, and acceleration was lukewarm unless you checked off all the options. The wagon was built for comfort, not speed, and you felt every bit of its mass when cornering or stopping. Inside the Squire wagon, you got bench seating front and rear, with optional third-row jump seats facing backward, a wide dashboard with faux wood applique to match the outside, vinyl everywhere, AM radio as standard, with optional 8-track and air conditioning. It was practical and roomy, but like the exterior, the inside was full of materials that looked like luxury but felt like cost-cutting. Cargo space was impressive with the seats down, but you had to lift a heavy tailgate and window combo to get to it. These wagons were not lightweight machines, and parking one felt like docking a barge. The Torino Squire wagon had some stiff competition. Chevrolet Caprice and Impala wagons offered more name recognition. Chrysler's Town & Country had a longer-standing reputation. Even within Ford, the LTD Country Squire was the more iconic full-size family hauler. And in just a few short years, the energy crisis would hammer V8 wagons. Buyers would shift toward smaller cars and eventually toward minivans and SUVs. Ford's branding would change, with Torino being phased out entirely by 1976. The Squire wagon ended up being a placeholder, a name and trim that never defined anything, and which the market quickly forgot. Unlike the later Country Squire models that appeared in pop culture, National Lampoon's Vacation, for example, the 1972 Torino Squire wagon is largely absent from public memory. Not a collectible, not a muscle car, not a design icon. It exists in dusty brochures and the fading memories of suburban driveways, but not in car shows or enthusiast forums. The 1972 Ford Torino Squire wagon is the definition of a product built to fill a market segment, and nothing more. It wasn't a failure. It did its job. But it's hard to find anyone today who remembers it fondly, or even remembers it at all. In the world of American cars, where even flops sometimes earn cult status, this wagon just quietly faded away, fake wood and all. By 1976, the American auto industry was knee-deep in the malaise era, a time defined by choked-down engines, bloated safety regulations, and a design language that prioritized compliance over creativity. GM's solution to tightening emissions and rising costs? Badge engineering. Take one platform, slap on some new badges, change the grille, and voila. 6 different new cars. The 1976 Buick Skylark S was Buick's compact offering, but in reality, it was a Chevrolet Nova in a nicer suit. And by nicer, We mean a few pieces of trim and a different steering wheel. It was a car made to fill space in showrooms, not anyone's heart. The S designation denoted the base trim, below the slightly nicer Skylark Custom. It was supposed to be an affordable, no-frills entry into the Buick family. But calling it a Buick didn't make it luxurious. It just made it confusing. Platform shared with the Chevrolet Nova, Oldsmobile Omega, and Pontiac Ventura, all part of GM's X-Body family. Design, blocky, bland, and instantly forgettable. A square grille, some chrome accents, and basic badging were about all that separated it from the Nova. It had the styling charisma of a rental appliance, and Buick loyalists, who were used to smooth cruisers and quiet power, weren't impressed. Under the hood, the Skylark S offered an uninspired buffet of underperforming engines. 231 cubic inch V6, introduced mid-year, one of the first American V6, but underpowered .250 cubic inch inline six, reliable but slow .260 and 350 V8S, adequate but strangled by emissions and poor gearing. Even with a V8, 0 to 60 took forever, often 10+ seconds, which felt slower in 1976 than it does today. And the handling was pure boat, soft springs, numb steering, and body roll galore. This wasn't a performance car. This wasn't a luxury car. This was a car that simply existed. The cabin featured vinyl bench seats, a plain dash, and materials that were more Fisher-Price than Fifth Avenue. Fake wood grain on the dash was standard. AM radio, manual windows, and no air conditioning came on the base model unless you paid more. Road noise was ever present, and ride comfort was meh, unless you had very low standards. The Buick feel of previous decades, quiet, plush, insulated, was mostly gone. What remained was a generic GM interior sprinkled with Buick logos. The 1976 Skylark S was a perfect example of GM's worst habits in the 70s. The car was mechanically identical to the Chevy Nova. Interiors were almost indistinguishable. The only luxury upgrades were nameplate deep. This wasn't platform sharing done elegantly. It was the copy-paste function in corporate form. Even the name Skylark, once attached to stylish 50s and 60s coupes, felt wasted on this anonymous compact. The Skylark S didn't make waves. It didn't make memories. It just moved quietly through dealerships and onto used car lots. Why? No standout styling. It looked like a fleet car from day one. No standout performance. It got you where you needed to go. Slowly. No special editions, no fame, no cult status. Unlike some of its GM siblings, like the Cosworth Vega or Pontiac Ventura GTO, the Skylark S never even tried to be exciting. Within a few years, it has little collector value, minimal online presence, zero pop culture footprint. Even Buick historians breeze past it as if they're embarrassed it existed. And honestly, they're not wrong. It was the Buick equivalent of white bread, inoffensive, unmemorable, and stale by the time it hit the shelf. The 1976 Buick Skylark S wasn't a disaster. It was something arguably worse, utterly forgettable. In an era when Detroit was pumping out underwhelming clones and calling it innovation, the Skylark S stood out by not standing out at all. It's a reminder of how far automakers can stray from their identity when cost-cutting and platform sharing become the only priorities. And in Buick's case, it's a brief, blurry chapter in a history that's otherwise been marked by comfort, style, and at least some sense of pride. Number 4. In the mid-1970s, the American car market was going through an identity crisis. The 1973 oil crisis had exposed the vulnerability of gas-guzzling land yachts, and yet Detroit's full-size sedans kept rolling off assembly lines like nothing had changed. Enter the 1975 Plymouth Grand Fury Custom, a car that was supposed to be Plymouth's top-tier offering. In theory, it was the division's luxury statement. In practice, it was an oversized, underpowered, and thoroughly forgettable barge that got lost in Chrysler's crowded lineup. Let's start with the obvious. This car was huge. Length, over 220 inches. Curb weight, nearly 4,500 pounds depending on trim and options. It shared its platform, the C-body, with the Dodge Royal Monaco and Chrysler New Yorker, making differentiation a challenge. Unfortunately, the Grand Fury Custom didn't do much to stand out. It wore the same generic slab-sided body as its siblings, had basic chrome accents, and lacked the gravitas or elegance of Chrysler's offerings. It was big, but not bold. The Custom badge might suggest upscale trim, but let's not kid ourselves. It was little more than vinyl seats, extra chrome, and maybe a slightly fancier clock. The dashboard was a flat sea of cheap plastic and faux wood grain. Power windows, air conditioning, and cruise control were optional. The ride was soft but not particularly quiet or refined. This car wasn't luxurious. It was a mid-priced full-sizer pretending to be something it wasn't. In fact, the only thing custom about the Custom was how customarily forgettable it was. The 1975 Grand Fury Custom came with a selection of big block V8s, but by that point, emissions regulations had neutered performance across the board. Engine options included 318 cubic inch 8, adequate but weak for the car's size, 360 and 400 V8s, more torque but still slow, 440 cubic inch V8, the top dog, yet sluggish thanks to power-choking emissions gear and tall gearing. None of these delivered excitement. Even the mighty 440 struggled under the weight of the car and the burden of fuel economy concerns. Acceleration was sluggish, and gas mileage hovered in the single digits. So you had a huge car, tons of steel, and an engine that wheezed instead of roared. The design was square, anonymous, and derivative. Compared to its Chrysler cousins, the Grand Fury looked like it had been styled by a committee whose only goal was not to offend anyone. Front fascia, squared off and uninspired. Rear end, blocky taillights and forgettable trim. Colors, earth tones, vinyl roofs, and fake chrome galore. The car had zero personality. No fins, no sweeping lines, no sporty cues. It looked like it belonged in the background of a police procedural, and that's exactly where many ended up. One of the Grand Fury's biggest issues was Chrysler's overstuffed lineup. Buyers could choose from similar full-size sedans across 3 divisions: Dodge Royal Monaco, Chrysler Newport, Plymouth Grand Fury, and they all looked nearly identical. The Grand Fury was supposed to be Plymouth's top-of-the-line offering, but it was completely overshadowed by its more prestigious and better-marketed siblings. If you wanted prestige, you bought a Chrysler. If you wanted fleet duty, you bought a Dodge. If you had no idea what you wanted, you ended up with a Plymouth Grand Fury Custom and promptly forgot about it. The 1975 Grand Fury Custom is a classic case of a car that had no unique identity. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most luxurious, and it wasn't particularly affordable. It just existed. Why it's forgotten, overshadowed by better-known Chrysler full-sizers, bland design that aged poorly even in its own decade. No performance pedigree, no collector following, often confused with the cop-spec Grand Fury models of later years. Even at car shows, you're more likely to spot a beat-up Dodge Monaco or a Chrysler New Yorker than a Grand Fury Custom. The Grand Fury name would limp along through the late 70s and into the 80s, attached to smaller platforms and police cruisers. But the 1975 Custom marked a nadir, a point where Plymouth's full-size identity was diluted beyond recognition. It never had the charm of a Fury 3 convertible, the brute force of a GTX, or even the practicality of a satellite wagon. It was simply the wrong car at the wrong time, dressed up in vinyl and chrome, hoping no one would notice how average it really was. The 1975 Plymouth Grand Fury Custom was Plymouth's idea of a top-tier car during a time when buyers were running away from land yachts as fast as possible. It offered nothing compelling, no standout features, no design innovation, no performance hook. It's been forgotten not because it was terrible, but because it failed to be anything at all. In an era of identity crisis, it was the ultimate shrug on wheels. Number 3, by the late 1970s, the American car market was shifting. Consumers wanted smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles, thanks to the aftermath of the oil crisis and the rising popularity of imports. Ford responded with the Fox platform, a new lightweight rear-wheel drive architecture designed to be versatile and cost-effective. The platform debuted with the 1978 Ford Fairmont, and alongside it came its upscale twin, the Mercury Zephyr. Where the Fairmont found decent traction thanks to its price and practicality, the Zephyr quietly appeared, blended in, and just as quietly disappeared. A car designed to do a job, not to be remembered. The Mercury Zephyr was among the first Fox body cars, which would later underpin Mustangs, Thunderbirds, Capri, and more. But while the platform was capable, the Zephyr was built to be basic, shared nearly all sheet metal and interior elements with the Ford Fairmont. Available as a sedan, wagon, or coupe, but offered little to distinguish itself. The design was ultra-conservative, boxy, angular, and cautious. Ford was trying to play it safe in a time of economic uncertainty. Unfortunately, that meant the Zephyr was bland by design, practical, yes, but also easily forgotten. Mercury as a brand had long served as a premium Ford. The Zephyr was marketed toward buyers who wanted Fairmont practicality with a hint of upscale styling, budget-conscious families looking for a smaller full-size alternative, rental fleets that wanted something a step above base model sedans. But the issue was clear. The Zephyr didn't offer enough differentiation to justify its existence. Most buyers either stuck with the Fairmont for value or stepped up to a Cougar or Montego for prestige. Like many late 70s compacts, the Zephyr offered a range of engines that emphasized economy over performance. 2.3-liter inline-4, anemic but fuel-efficient. 3.3-liter inline-6, smooth, slow, and utterly uninspiring. 5.0-liter V8, 302, available but detuned, especially with California emissions equipment. You could get a manual transmission or an automatic, but neither setup made the Zephyr feel lively. It drove like an appliance, and that's how most people treated it. The 1978 Zephyr's styling was tidy and squared off, but offered none of the flair Mercury had once been known for. The grille and trim were slightly glitzier than the Fairmont's, but not by much. Interior trim materials were modestly nicer, but hardly luxurious. Vinyl tops and opera windows were available for the fashion-conscious, but those only emphasized how much the Zephyr was trying to pretend. It looked like something your accountant would buy, practical, mature, restrained, and utterly forgettable. The Zephyr was decently reliable for its day. It was easy to service, cheap to run, built from proven components. But that's not a legacy most cars want. The Zephyr was dependable to a fault, but gave you no reason to talk about it or remember it fondly. It simply did its job and left no impression. The Zephyr didn't flop exactly. It just never stood out. Buyers who wanted a Fairmont with nicer trim might give it a glance, but even that pool was limited. Sales were okay initially, but dipped as the Fox platform expanded. The car never developed a loyal following or enthusiast base. By the early 80s, the Zephyr was just another fleet special. By 1983, the Zephyr was gone, replaced and forgotten, even by Mercury itself. The Mercury Zephyr is now little more than a historical footnote in Fox body history. It lacks the performance cred of the Mustang, the uniqueness of the Capri, or even the nostalgia of the Fairmont. Reasons it faded from memory: no standout trim or performance version, no collector interest, never featured in pop culture or motorsports, easily mistaken for its Ford sibling. Even among Mercury fans, the Zephyr is a blank spot. The 1978 Mercury Zephyr wasn't terrible. It wasn't unreliable. It wasn't even ugly. But that's what doomed it. It was a completely inoffensive, utterly uninspiring mid-size sedan. It had no hook, no edge, no reason to stand out. In a market that was changing fast, Mercury played it safe, and the Zephyr faded into the fog of fleet car anonymity. Number 2. By 1977, Pontiac was trying to adapt to a changing automotive landscape. The days of full-size muscle cars were dwindling, and the shift toward more compact and fuel-efficient vehicles was evident. The Pontiac Phoenix was created as part of this shift, but it ended up as a car lost in the shuffle, overshadowed by its own siblings and future competitors. This was the first generation of the Phoenix, and while its intentions were clear, its execution was anything but memorable. The Pontiac Phoenix was conceived as a compact car that could fill the void between Pontiac's larger Ventura, a mid-size car, and the upcoming front-wheel drive models that would dominate the 1980s. But it was also caught in the transition between two worlds. On one hand, it carried elements of the old-school rear-wheel drive architecture, which was quickly being phased out. On the other hand, the Phoenix was meant to be more fuel-efficient and practical, without embracing the full economy car mindset that was sweeping through the industry. Thus, the Phoenix was a confusing blend of old and new, a vehicle that didn't quite fit in with either world. It was trying to appeal to an audience that was already shifting towards more modern, smaller cars like the Chevrolet Chevette or the front-wheel drive Pontiac Sunbird, making the Phoenix a product that had already started to feel outdated before it even hit the streets. The Phoenix was built on the X-Body platform, shared with other GM models like the Chevrolet Nova and the Chevrolet Ventura. This was not inherently bad. It was a solid, reliable platform. But it meant that the Phoenix was simply a rebadged and slightly tweaked version of its GM counterparts, lacking a unique identity. Engines. The Phoenix came with a range of inline-4 and V6 engines. The base engine was a 2.5-liter four-cylinder with relatively modest power outputs, while the available V6 offered slightly better performance but still lacked the oomph of some of Pontiac's past performance models. Transmission options. Buyers could choose between a 3-speed manual or a 3-speed automatic, both of which were functional but lacked any excitement. The engine options were efficient for the time, but they weren't anything special. The Phoenix was built for economy and practicality, not for performance, especially when compared to some of Pontiac's more daring muscle cars of the past. The 1977 Pontiac Phoenix styling was a mixed bag. It wasn't ugly, but it certainly didn't stand out. The car's design was heavily influenced by the Ventura, but it was also a lot less dramatic. The exterior was straightforward, with a flat, boxy front end, a wide grille, and angular body lines that didn't have much character. The coupe version was slightly sportier, with a sloping roofline, but overall, the Phoenix was more about utility than flair. Inside, the cabin was fairly standard for the time, offering simple, straightforward materials with little to distinguish it from any other compact car of the era. It was functional but unmemorable. Compared to Pontiac's earlier cars, which were known for their bold, muscular looks, the Phoenix seemed like a half-hearted attempt to be a part of a trend without fully committing to it. Pontiac released the Phoenix in 1977, positioning it as a compact car that could offer better value and more refinement than the more utilitarian models that dominated the segment. Unfortunately, it didn't create any real excitement among buyers. It simply existed. It wasn't especially popular in comparison to the more distinctive Chevrolet Nova, which shared the same platform. It lacked the performance edge that Pontiac buyers expected after years of muscle car glory. With the automotive world quickly moving toward more efficient, smaller, and front-wheel drive vehicles, the Phoenix couldn't make a strong argument for itself. Even in Pontiac's lineup, the Phoenix was hard to market, as it sat awkwardly between the Ventura and the upcoming front-wheel drive cars like the Pontiac Sunbird. The Phoenix was neither a full-size car nor a true compact, and as a result, it had no clear identity. The Phoenix's failure to carve out its own niche became more apparent over time. After a single year of production, the model was quickly overshadowed by Pontiac's shift toward more contemporary designs. By the time the second generation of the Phoenix arrived in 1980, it was clear that the first-gen model was largely forgotten. The second-gen Phoenix was redesigned as a front-wheel drive car, aligning more with the trends of the 1980s. As for the 1977 version, it didn't even have much of a reputation. It was a stopgap model, a placeholder until Pontiac could fully embrace. The 1977 Pontiac Phoenix was a well-intentioned model that ultimately found itself out of place. It didn't have the muscle car charisma of Pontiac's earlier vehicles, nor did it have the revolutionary appeal of the front-wheel drive models that would follow. Number 1. By 1979, Oldsmobile was winding down its rear-wheel drive models in favor of the front-wheel drive revolution that would define the 1980s. One of the last vehicles in the Oldsmobile lineup to ride on this traditional rear-wheel drive architecture was the Omega, which had been introduced in 1973 as part of GM's X-Body platform. The 1979 Oldsmobile Omega Brougham represented the car's final years, and it was drenched in chrome and luxury touches that gave it an appearance of opulence. But in reality, it was a dull and unmemorable car that struggled to stay relevant as the automotive industry moved forward. The 1979 Omega Brougham was part of the X-Body platform family, which included other GM models like the Chevrolet Nova, Pontiac Phoenix, and the Buick Skylark. While these cars were compact sedans, they were all too often seen as generic, utilitarian vehicles in the eyes of the public. Shared platform. Despite different badges, these models all had similar engineering and components. This meant that the Omega wasn't distinct enough to stand out in the compact car segment. Rear-wheel drive. By 1979, rear-wheel drive was already on the way out, and the Omega was part of GM's last efforts to squeeze out some relevance from the old platform before transitioning to front-wheel drive options. Competitors. It faced stiff competition from more forward-thinking models like the Chevrolet Chevette or Pontiac Sunbird, which were already making use of smaller, more fuel-efficient designs. The Omega's dated architecture made it hard to keep up. The Brougham trim package on the 1979 Omega was aimed at offering a more luxurious experience, with chrome accents and plush interiors. It was essentially a last-ditch effort to elevate the Omega into something more appealing to buyers who were looking for a compact car with some semblance of luxury. Exterior features. The Omega Brougham came with chrome bumpers, full-length body moldings, and chrome window trim. It was trying to dress up a relatively ordinary car with a dose of luxury flair that was all too common in the late 70s. Interior features. Inside, the Brougham trim featured velour upholstery, wood grain accents, and luxury carpeting, the kinds of details that made it feel more upscale. However, these touches felt forced on a car that was fundamentally bland in design. The problem: despite the chrome and velour, the Omega Brougham never felt like a truly luxurious car. It was trying to be something it wasn't, and it came across as unconvincing. It lacked the style and performance of other, more genuinely upscale vehicles, even within GM's own lineup. When it came to performance, the 1979 Omega Brougham didn't have much to offer. GM's X-Body platform was designed for economy and affordability, but that came at the expense of driving enjoyment or excitement. Engine options. The Omega Brougham came with a 231 cubic inch V6 engine as the standard powertrain, which produced a modest 110 horsepower. There was also an available 250 cubic inch inline-six engine, but neither engine offered anything close to thrilling performance. Transmission. The Omega Brougham came equipped with a 3-speed automatic transmission or an optional 4-speed manual. Neither transmission setup contributed to an exciting or engaging driving experience. Handling. The car's handling was sluggish, with soft suspension designed for comfort rather than performance. While this made it easy to drive, it also made it less memorable compared to other compact sedans in the same era, especially as the fuel crisis of the 1970s had already shifted buyer priorities towards efficiency and practicality. The result? A car that was boring to drive and offered little in terms of dynamic engagement, even for those looking for a simple daily driver. By 1979, GM was already shifting its focus to front-wheel drive models. The X-Body platform, with its rear-wheel drive layout, was now seen as outdated. The Omega Brougham was a last-gasp attempt to sell rear-wheel drive cars in an era where buyers were increasingly looking for smaller, more efficient, and modern front-wheel drive vehicles. Shift to front-wheel drive. The Chevrolet Citation, introduced in 1980, marked the end of the X-Body platform and the beginning of GM's front-wheel drive era. The front-wheel drive design was more space-efficient, easier to manufacture, and offered better fuel economy, qualities that buyers were now prioritizing. The Omega's fate. The Omega was a victim of this transition, caught at the tail end of an era that was quickly fading. The Brougham trim and chrome details couldn't save it from the fact that it was outdated in both design and performance.